Hi guys, my name is Kat Kapatiansky and I'm an MD PhD student working with Dr. Samir Sheth here at Baylor College of Medicine. And in our lab we have the incredibly rare privilege to work with neurosurgical patients that are implanted with intracranial electrodes so that we can record directly from the human brain. And during my PhD, I'm using AI models to better understand the neurophysiology underlying complex human behavior in hopes of identifying biomarkers of emotional state. So a major challenge for treating disorders like depression and anxiety is that emotions are inherently difficult to measure. And asking someone how they feel may be influenced by a million different factors, like whether they are hungry, if they got enough sleep, or if they were just stuck in traffic. And really, emotions are more complex than any of these specific labels, and instead fall in a continuous spectrum of valence, from unpleasant to pleasant, and arousal, from mild to intense. And rather than being fixed, our emotions are always in flux. So they need to be studied in ways that allow us to measure them as they're changing continuously moment to moment. So the current gold standard for measuring mood is self-report, but it has some major limitations. First, these scales rely on patients having perfect insight and recall, which is probably unrealistic for most of us. But more importantly, alexithymia, or the inability to recognize and verbalize emotions, is particularly increased in these populations with depression and affective disorders. Second, even with frequent administration of these questionnaires, such as through ecological momentary assessment, or EMA, sampling is still inevitably sparse, and repeated assessment increases patient burden while decreasing engagement and adherence over time. And this is important because we can only treat symptoms as well as we can measure them. So relying on self-report can mean misdiagnosis. So if a patient only reports negative symptoms, for example, we may misdiagnose them with unipolar rather than bipolar depression. And what's worse, we would then incorrectly treat them as such. And if we use these scales to assess response to treatment, we may not see change in their self-reported scales while their behaviors and actions tell a different story. And in fact, we repeatedly see this in our patients during deep brain stimulation. So they might exhibit clear behavioral effects during stimulation adjustments, but their values on these self-report scales don't change. So to overcome these issues, there's an increasing shift away from constrained task-based research designs, instead towards more naturalistic ones that allow for analysis of observed behavior in ethologically relevant contexts. And this may be through tasks that better reflect real experiences, such as watching movies, or the use of augmented or virtual reality to recreate movement through space, for example. Or better yet, observation of people as they engage in their normal day-to-day activities. And previous work, for example, has looked at, as mentioned, smartphone diaries and social media use, as well as actigraphy data to look at rest and activity levels. And all these together have really helped create this deep phenotyping of behavior. But naturalistic designs like these really involve large amounts of data. And so with the advent of machine learning and AI models, we've allowed for processing and analysis of big data in a much faster and more scalable way. So LLMs, for example, can assign sentiment to diary transcripts, and machine learning models can uncover which specific types of stressors may predict psychiatric symptoms. So to take advantage of this methodological progress, we've also transformed the way that we collect our data. So we've built an innovative multimodal recording suite equipped with multiple microphones, cameras, and wearables like Oura Rings and Apple Watches. And so this allows us to capture spontaneous behavior such as speech, facial expressions, and heart rate variability. And by synchronizing these signals with brain activity, we can analyze them all together precisely as they're happening on the order of seconds. So here are some examples of the multiple synchronized data streams that we collect for each patient using this continuous recording system in the hospital. So infrared cameras from a variety of angles and focal distances allow us to capture facial expressions, gestures, and pose from both the patient and other speakers. Multiple microphones allow us to capture both patient and non-patient speech with high fidelity. And pupillometry, heart rate, and sleep stage data provide additional physiological information for deep phenotyping. Finally, dense neural recordings from multiple electrodes in a variety of brain regions allow for detailed investigation of the brain dynamics underlying these complex human behaviors. So my goal is to build a model that identifies points of convergence across these different modalities, taking in audio, video, and physiological data in order to reliably predict changes in emotional state. And next, I'll show you an example of my analyses in one of these modalities, specifically patient speech. So here we'll look at one example patient participating in an ongoing clinical trial of deep brain stimulation, or DBS, for treatment-resistant depression. So the goals of this multi-site trial are to understand the network dysfunction underlying depressed mood and use this information to more optimally engage these pathological circuits and steer them back to health. So patients are implanted with deep brain stimulation electrodes as well as multiple stereo EEG electrodes in regions relevant to mood, like limbic regions such as the amygdala and anterior cingulate, as well as regions of the prefrontal cortex. And they're monitored for 10 days in this recording suite that I previously described as they complete a variety of research tasks and interact with their family, visitors, clinicians, research staff. And so in this patient, for example, we recorded 14 such natural conversations that covered a variety of topics from childhood memories to frustrations earlier that day, and even topics like suicide or finding love. So here's an example audio clip of the patient sharing about their college experience.
It was kind of a tricky, lunch was hard. Sometimes I would just bring things and hide somewhere like in the library and just eat on my own because even when I would sit alone at a table and somebody would invite me over to their table, which was nice, you know, that's a really nice thing to do, it was still uncomfortable because I felt like an interloper. And they would all talk to each other, but they kind of cut me out of the conversation and I felt like I didn't belong. So
there's clearly a lot of emotion being conveyed in these conversations. And to analyze these data, we built an automated pipeline for detecting when the patient is speaking and extracted valence and arousal dimensions of emotion using an open source pre-trained model for speech emotion recognition based on Wave2Vec 2.0. We could then visualize these extracted features to show the moment-to-moment fluctuations in emotional arousal, shown in the top row, and valence on the bottom row over time. So, compared with self-report, we get a much more fine-grained, temporally resolved, and dimensional representation of emotional change. We can also plot these features in valence arousal space to show the overall variation in emotions across all conversations. And since we're recording 24/7, we're able to capture a wide range of emotions from angry to excited to sad and really everything in between. And unlike EMA, our method is not susceptible to recall and response bias, and in fact, it requires no conscious effort at all. We're simply capturing these emotions as they come up naturally. Next, we can relate these behavioral features to brain activity, and for this, we use canonical correlation analysis, which is a technique for finding relationships between two multidimensional variables. So first, we create matrices for each of the feature sets over time. Here, emotion is in green and neural activity is in purple. Next, we identify the subspace where these two matrices maximally correlate, as you can see with the overlapping traces here showing the first canonical component pair. So using this technique, we found a distinct association between emotion features of speech and spectral neural features. So in panel A, we're showing the relative weights of both the arousal and valence values for this first canonical correlate pair. And specifically, as you can see, they are positive values for both valence and arousal, which together represent an overall positive affective state. So to show this in a more intuitive way, this might reflect a state somewhere here in the first quadrant of valence arousal space. Now in panel B, we have the relative weights of neural activity patterns for the same canonical component. And in this figure, brain regions are on the x-axis, frequency is on the y-axis, from high frequency at the bottom to low frequency at the top. And the color represents either greater in red or lower in blue correlation of each of these spatiospectral features to the emotion features in panel A. So we found that positive arousal and valence, again on the left, are correlated with a pattern of increased high frequency activity and decreased low frequency activity across all frontotemporal regions. And we are particularly excited by this result because it recapitulates a pattern that's been previously found both in our lab and in Eddie Chang's lab at UCSF, showing this neural activity signature to be associated with decreased depression severity as well as positive affective behaviors. This finding, therefore, provides a potential brain target state for us to achieve with neuromodulation. So if we can push the brain into this state of increased high frequency and decreased low frequency activity, perhaps we can help patients shift out of a persistently depressed mood into more positive emotional states. We're now using AI models to dig deeper into these behavioral features of emotion. So if you think about it, how do any of us make sense of what another person is feeling? We have to synthesize what they say or do with how they say or do it. So using an LLM, for example, we can take transcripts and compare linguistic features of what patients are saying, such as the use of self pronouns versus other pronouns, for example, or past tense for abuse versus present tense for abuse. And conversely, we can use models like Parselmouth to compare acoustic features like speech amplitude, frequency, and rate. which reflect the how of a patient's emotional expression. And in fact, others in our lab have recently found that increased speech rate, shown in green on the bottom, correlates with increased beta power, shown in black, in the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex during high amplitude deep brain stimulation. So these are just some examples of what we can do with speech. And as I mentioned, we have many other modalities and many other analyses to explore. So in summary, if we can develop better tools to measure behavior, we can then use them to more precisely identify neurobehavioral biomarkers of emotion and other phenomena that are at the core of our human experience. So as I look forward to my career as a neurosurgeon scientist, I feel extremely fortunate to be entering the field at this time of rapid AI development. I'm excited to continue leveraging these evolving models so that we can take full advantage of the rare data that we're able to collect from our patients. And ultimately, I hope this work helps to improve how we diagnose, assess, and treat neurological and psychiatric disorders. So with that, I'd like to thank my mentors and collaborators and everyone else who's made this work so fun.
Wonderful talk, thank you. So I think we have a little bit of time for some questions. Anyone? Okay.
Right. How to convert the different language to, for example, in India, there is a language called Tamil. The voice from the 10 years old child. Okay, how you convert that language to your algorithm or your program?
That's a great question. So there's definitely models for different languages that I think use the transformer structure to basically, you can convert from one language to another. So theoretically, I guess you could convert from that language to English and move forward. But I think ideally you use a model that's trained on that particular language, and then you can use these same techniques.
Hi, thank you. Great presentation. This is really interesting, and it's exciting to think about the different ways that you can take all these tools and converge them into these methods from this model. So my question is, I have a multifaceted question. I guess it's first was, how many patients did you use, and how were they selected? And when you're looking at these folks over time, I'm guessing they're there the whole time. They're not going home or anything. They're staying in there the whole time. So as you were speaking, my thought was, wow, that sounds like I would kind of be stressed out and feel like I would want to leave. You know, how do you adjust for that change over time? And also I did see briefly your graph looking at depression severity and how it seemed like it actually decreased for most of your patients over time, or the ones that you showed. Can you speak to any of that and just that time factor?
Totally. Love that question. It's one that we think about a lot. So we have a really, like I mentioned, unique patient population that we get to work with this clinical trial. These are all patients that are treatment resistant, so nothing else has worked for their depression. They're really at this extreme end of the depression spectrum. And so they're really quite desperate for any kind of a cure. So they choose to be in this clinical trial. They're particularly interested in participating in this research and helping others that might be in a similar state. And so I've consistently been surprised by how engaged these patients are. They sign up knowing that this is kind of the expectation. And in fact, this decreased depression severity over their 10-day stay, we've had a lot of conversations about whether that might be the therapeutic effect of being surrounded by clinicians for that entire time and research staff and having people to talk to. The patients themselves report that that's something that they really enjoy and feel like they really benefit from. That being said, we also have another patient population that we have the privilege of working with. And these are patients with refractory epilepsy, so those that basically have electrodes implanted so that we can better understand where their epilepsy is coming from. And these patients also have to be there for the duration of time until we can identify the focus of their seizures. And so for them, it's dependent on kind of what they're feeling, what they're up to. So some of our tasks that maybe test memory, some of them might think those are really boring, some might like the conversation, some might not. So it's a little bit more variable there. But what I get from using both these populations is really covering the spectrum of depression. So some of our epilepsy patients have high comorbid depression and some have none. And so in my analyses that are ongoing, we'll hopefully be able to cover that full spectrum.